Hey guys, tonight we drift into the echoing halls of medieval palaces, where the chandeliers are dripping with wax, the courtyards smell faintly of damp stone, and your footsteps trail along marble floors that were polished by servants who probably weren't paid nearly enough. You find yourself standing inside a vast, great hall, the kind of place where tapestries taller than a house stretch from floor to ceiling, their woven figures frozen mid-battle, mid-hunt, or mid-kiss. The air is thick with smoke from torches and hearths, and you can almost hear the murmur of nobles whispering over goblets of wine as they wait for the main event, the entrance of a bride, a teenage bride. She is nervous, dressed in layers of velvet heavier than she is, a coronet slipping slightly over hair that was braided with more ribbons than she had years. Aristocrats in the front rows are eyeing her like one might assess a prized racehorse, checking posture, fertility, and of course her family's political utility. You probably won't survive this kind of scrutiny. Even your posture after dinner would be disqualifying. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you feel like it, tell me your location and the local time right now. I always love to see where people are drifting off from. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The sight of such young brides wasn't unusual. In fact, aristocrats across Europe considered teenage marriages the most efficient way to safeguard dynasties. A girl of 13 or 14 wasn't seen as fragile in the way we think of teenagers today. She was thought of as ripe, which sounds deeply unsettling, like an overripe banana in a fruit bowl. But that was the language of the time. Fertility was the prized commodity, and youth was its guarantee. Nobles saw their daughters as investments, polished up, and exchanged like gold coins. In France during the 14th century, it wasn't uncommon for noble girls to be betrothed before they even knew how to properly read. Margaret Beaufort, for example, the mother of Henry VII of England, was married at 12 and pregnant at 13. Historians still argue whether she ever recovered from that traumatic childbirth, physically or emotionally. You can almost imagine her clutching her swollen belly in the middle of a cold castle chamber, with midwives whispering prayers into the smoky air, hoping she'd produce the heir her family so desperately needed. But here's the quirky twist. While noble daughters were hurried into marriage, noble sons often spent those years practicing falconry or learning to joust, free from the same ticking fertility clock. In fact, some boys were married by proxy while still in short trousers. The paperwork might declare them husbands, but their lives didn't change until much later. Picture a 10-year-old boy being told he's now officially married to a duchess in Burgundy. He probably went right back to playing with his wooden sword. For the girls, however, the marriage was immediate, and the hall you're standing in tonight represents that terrifying transition. One day, she's a child being scolded for spilling honey on her embroidery. The next, she's led down the aisle to the sound of bells and trumpets. If you look closely at the audience in this imagined hall, you can see the glances. They're not looking at her face, not at her dreams or fears, but at her hips. Will she bear children? Will she survive childbirth long enough to produce more than one? The reality check here is brutal. These weddings weren't about love. They were about power, survival, and reputation. The girl was a vessel, and the boy, if he was older, was expected to steer the family fortunes through her body. The irony is that many aristocratic men didn't particularly care about their wives after the marriage. Mistresses, politics, and hunting parties occupied their attention. Still, the hall was filled with celebration. Trumpeters would blast until your ears rang, and roasted boar was paraded across the tables. Guests raised cups of mead to toast the union, pretending this awkward pairing was a grand romance for the ages. And if you squint hard enough, you might even see a jester making jokes in the corner, probably something about how young the bride looked compared to the groom. Medieval humor wasn't subtle. The most unsettling detail. Some of these girls were so small that seamstresses had to pad their gowns to make them look older. Imagine that, silk sleeves stuffed like pillows to create the illusion of a mature body, while underneath the girl was still losing her baby teeth, and yet no one in that hall thought it strange. As the bride takes her seat beside her new husband, who might be twice her age or older, you realize that this entire spectacle is less about the people involved and more about the families standing behind them. Those velvet curtains conceal a ledger book thicker than any Bible, full of debts, promises, and treaties. A noble marriage wasn't the end of a love story, it was the opening move in a dangerous chess game. And so the bride sits silently, her hands folded, as her new relatives size her up. Some whisper their approval, some smirk at her trembling lips, and others are already calculating the day her first child will be born. You can almost feel the weight of those expectations pressing down on her like the stone ceiling above. That is the world you now step into, lavish, glittering, but also suffocating, where fragile brides became the currency of dynasties, and the grandest halls hid the most fragile truths. You linger in that vast hall a little longer, letting the echoes of laughter and the clinking of goblets fade, and you realize the entire spectacle is glued together, not by romance, but by money. Wealth looms over every smile, every bow, every congratulatory handshake. Aristocratic marriages, particularly those of teenagers, were essentially balance sheets wrapped in lace and satin. The bride's dowry, chests of coins, bolts of silk, even entire estates, was the price of entry into this glittering world. Imagine the scene, a young girl trembling under a veil while behind her, servants strain to carry crates of silverware into the hall. Her worth is measured not in her smile, but in how many vineyards her father signed over in the marriage contract. In Renaissance Italy, dowries could be so massive that families bankrupted themselves just to marry their daughters upward. There's even a record of Florentine fathers taking out loans, essentially mortgaging their estates, so their girls could land a title. Historians still argue whether these investments actually secured long-term prestige or just created more debt-riddled tragedies. It wasn't just about the bride's family giving things away. Wealth flowed both ways. A powerful groom's family might offer lands, horses, or an annual pension to ensure their new daughter-in-law's comfort, or more accurately, to ensure her loyalty. You, standing off to the side, probably notice that everyone in the room is keeping score. One uncle leans over to whisper how many acres the bride's family promised. Another snickers at the jewels being exchanged, calculating whether the emeralds are genuine. The real love letters of the period weren't drenched in poetry, but in accounting terms. Marriage contracts read like business agreements. They listed obligations, penalties, and clauses about inheritance rights. If you expected a Shakespearean sonnet declaring undying devotion, well, you'd be sorely disappointed. These were more like the fine print of an insurance policy. One quirky tidbit: in some regions, contracts even included livestock inventories. Picture a teenage bride blushing while her dowry is announced. Alongside her person, the lady contributes 5 dairy cows and a pair of particularly stubborn donkeys. The irony, of course, is that while wealth was meant to glue marriages together, it often pried them apart. Dowry disputes could spark feuds that lasted generations. If a husband squandered his wife's dowry, her family could drag him to court, or, at least, threaten to. Families would fight over whether a promised vineyard really counted if half its vines had died in a frost. You probably wouldn't survive this kind of courtroom drama. It's like medieval Judge Judy, but with swords waiting outside the chamber. At the center of it all were the teenagers, bewildered pawns in a game of wealth management. A girl might be told to smile sweetly beside her husband, but what she really represented was a set of financial ties stretching across borders. In France, when the Duke of Burgundy married Margaret of York, the celebrations weren't just about the couple, they were about the massive dowry Margaret brought, which included precious tapestries so large they could wallpaper entire castles. Guests weren't whispering about her charm, they were calculating the political dividends woven into those golden threads. Even kings weren't exempt from this. Consider Charles VI of France, who married Isabeau of Bavaria when she was just about 15. Her dowry wasn't just cash, it was an alliance, a buffer against enemies, and a reminder that even the mightiest monarchs needed a healthy infusion of wealth to keep their realms afloat. Yet historians still debate whether the staggering sums Isabeau's family provided truly strengthened France, or whether it was squandered in the endless power struggles of the time. And here's where the gentle sarcasm slips in. Imagine being a teenager, barely able to decide what color shoes you like, and suddenly your father is negotiating the annual yield of vineyards you've never even visited, all because of you. You probably would have preferred just a puppy. The cruel reality is that affection barely mattered. If a nobleman did happen to fall in love with his teenage bride, it was considered a bonus, not the purpose of the union. More often than not, affection developed between mistresses and lovers, while marriages remained locked in the currency of survival. Those lavish banquets and ornate gowns were all theatre, staging wealth as though it were love. Yet even amidst the contracts and coins there were sparks of human feeling. Occasionally, a young couple found comfort in one another. There are letters where brides wrote about their husbands with genuine tenderness, though skeptically you might note these were far rarer than the ledgers recording sheep and acres. Still, they remind you that behind the arithmetic of aristocracy, teenagers were still teenagers, caught between the weight of dynasties and the flutter of youthful hearts. And as the feast dies down in that hall, the wealth is what lingers, the glitter of gold plates stacked at the high table, the whispers about estates gained or lost, the knowledge that this marriage was never just two people, it was two fortunes stitched together, with fragile teenage hands sewing the seam. The echoes of dowries and ledgers fade as your attention shifts to the throne itself, where history's youngest queens once sat, their crowns slightly too heavy for their still growing heads. In the medieval and Renaissance world, queenship was often thrust upon girls barely into their teens, and the crown was less a glittering accessory than a burden that made childhood vanish overnight. Take Mary, Queen of Scots, who became queen when she was only 6 days old. Granted, she wasn't toddling around with a crown strapped to her soft head. Regents ruled in her stead, but her marriage prospects were discussed before she could speak. By the time she was a teenager, she was already a pawn in Europe's elaborate marriage market, promised first to an English prince, then shipped off to France to wed the Dauphin. Historians still argue whether her youth made her vulnerable to manipulation or whether her intelligence gave her more agency than we give her credit for. Either way, she never got to experience a normal adolescence. You think your teenage years were awkward? Try doing them under the gaze of papal legates and suspicious ambassadors. Europe's royal dynasties treated daughters like movable chess pieces. A French princess of 13 might be married to a Spanish prince twice her age, purely so their parents could ink a treaty. Catherine de' Medici was just 14 when she married Henry, Duke of Orléans, later King Henry II of France. She was swept from Florence to Paris, her dowry stuffed with jewels and tapestries, her future entirely mapped out by men who spoke of her like one might speak of imported wine. Imagine the pressure of stepping into a foreign court, where every lady-in-waiting judged her accent, her clothing, her fertility. Sometimes these marriages placed teen queens in situations that were downright bizarre. Anne of Brittany, married off at just 14, had to endure the strange humiliation of having her marriage annulled and repeated multiple times for political convenience. It was like being stuck in a revolving door wedding chapel, but instead of Elvis officiating, it was bishops and dukes. The justification, of course, always circled back to dynasties. Teenage queens were seen as the perfect vessels to secure an heir quickly and, ideally, repeatedly. Fertility was equated with stability. Monarchs couldn't wait around for love to blossom. Babies had to arrive before rival claimants sharpened their swords. You can picture the nervous courtiers counting months on their fingers, whispering anxiously outside the queen's bedchamber, hoping the union would bear fruit. If she failed, it wasn't the king who got the blame. And here's a quirky little fact. In some royal households, astrologers were consulted to determine the best nights for consummation. Picture a grey-bearded man pointing at a star chart, solemnly advising that Mars, being in retrograde, meant the teenage queen should wait until next Tuesday. Romance, clearly, was not the priority. The mismatch of ages was glaring. Isabella of Valois was married to Richard II of England when she was just 6 years old. The marriage wasn't consummated immediately, thankfully, but she was paraded around court as queen. Grown nobles bowed to a child who probably still collected dolls. You standing in that hall might find it surreal. Watching a court of armoured knights kneel before a girl with ribbons in her hair, while chroniclers scribbled earnestly about the dignity of her bearing. Of course, these unions often raised eyebrows even in their own time. Some chroniclers complained that such young brides were unprepared to govern, while others praised them for their adaptability. Historians today debate whether teen queens were genuinely powerless or whether their youth allowed them to maneuver in ways older women couldn't. A teenage queen, after all, could play the innocent, wielding pity or charm in negotiations. But for most, life was less about maneuvering and more about survival. The weight of expectation was staggering. Produce heirs, learn court etiquette, endure political pressure. All while still figuring out how to exist in a body that wasn't done growing. Imagine being told at 14 that your worth depended on whether you could bear a son by Christmas. No wonder so many teenage queens faded quickly into history, their names remembered only because of the sons or miscarriages they produced. Yet portraits immortalize them as serene and composed, pearls twined in their hair, hands folded gracefully. You glance at one such painting and know that behind the brushstrokes was a teenager quaking with nerves, terrified of failing in her first royal duty. The art was propaganda, smoothing over the reality that these girls were children asked to perform adult roles in the most unforgiving spotlight. So as you drift through the gallery of teenage queens, you see not just jewels and thrones, but fragility painted over with dignity. Behind every crown, behind every solemn gaze, lay a girl robbed of youth, her childhood traded for a treaty, her wedding feast nothing more than a signature on the chessboard of power. The glitter of crowns and the thunder of royal processions soon fade into something far more intimate and unsettling. The way aristocrats treated bodies, especially teenage bodies, as bargaining chips. You walk now through the quieter corridors of castles where the air smells of beeswax polish and damp wool, and you realize that beneath all the ceremonies the real obsession was fertility. A girl's body was not her own, it was a dynasty's insurance policy. Picture this, a bride of 13 led into a chamber with tapestries depicting mythical lovers. The candles flicker, shadows stretch, and in the hush of the night, she isn't a child anymore, at least not in the eyes of her family. Her body has been declared suitable because menstruation has begun. Medieval parents marked that first cycle not with sympathy or whispered advice, but with relief. It meant she could bear heirs, and heirs meant security. Historians still argue whether this biological milestone was viewed with reverence or calculation, but the outcome was the same. She was deemed ready. It sounds cruelly transactional, but aristocrats were obsessed with continuity. Dynasties had collapsed over a lack of heirs. Henry the King of England's entire marital saga proves that point centuries later. Fertility was not just personal, it was political. A teenage bride's womb symbolized the survival of titles, lands, and entire kingdoms. You probably won't survive the thought of your reproductive organs being publicly debated at a banquet, but for noble girls it was dinner conversation. The quirky part? Not everyone agreed on the best age. In some regions, especially in southern Europe, marriage at 12 or 13 was common. In northern Europe, families often waited until 15 or 16. The church itself was inconsistent. Canon law technically allowed girls to marry at 12 and boys at 14, but local customs sometimes nudged the age higher. You can imagine the confusion. Was your daughter ripe at 13 in Florence, but too green at the same age in York? Parents consulted priests, physicians, and sometimes fortune-tellers. Yes, there are records of families asking astrologers when a girl's body would be most favorable for producing sons. The imbalance of expectations was glaring. Boys were often given time to grow into their roles, but girls were pushed straight from childhood into marriage beds. You picture a gangly teenage groom awkwardly holding a falcon, while his equally young bride was quietly reminded by her governess how to comport herself during her wedding night. There was no equality in the burden. Her body was the proving ground, his just the signature. And while the grand halls boasted of marriages as alliances, in the private chambers it was the bride's body that bore the cost. Early pregnancies came with immense risks. Imagine a girl not fully grown herself carrying a child, her bones still lengthening, her pelvis not fully developed. Maternal mortality soared. Midwives whispered prayers, priests performed blessings, but all the gilded tapestries in the world couldn't disguise the danger. Some queens died in childbirth before their 20th birthday, remembered only as tragic figures in chronicles written by men who barely noted their names. Yet oddly enough, teenage fertility was sometimes romanticized. Poets compared young brides to blooming flowers, fresh spring lambs, or, less flatteringly, ripening fruit. The imagery was everywhere, a kind of literary pat on the back for parents who rushed their daughters into unions. You probably wouldn't enjoy being compared to a pair at a banquet toast, but in their minds, this was elegance. And here's the sardonic twist. For all their obsession with biology, aristocrats rarely understood it. Medieval medicine insisted that a woman's womb could wander around her body, if not occupied by pregnancy, causing hysteria. So marrying girls young was partly justified as a way to stabilize them. Historians still argue whether these bizarre medical theories genuinely shaped marriage practices or were just convenient excuses to hurry along political deals. Think again of that 14-year-old duchess, standing in her ornate gown, painted as the matron of her house. Behind the portraits and the feasts was the simple, harsh calculation. Her body was the battlefield on which dynasties fought for survival. You see her smile frozen in oil paint, but in her eyes there's the faint glimmer of a teenager wondering why she was never allowed to simply be. And so wandering these castle corridors, you understand why aristocrats married teenagers, because to them, fertility was security, and security was worth more than childhood. The irony, of course, is that dynasties obsessed with survival often lost the very thing they clung to, leaving behind only cold stone, faded tapestries, and portraits of children burdened with crowns too heavy for their heads. The footsteps in those stone corridors lead you now to a vast cathedral, the air thick with incense, where the sound of chanting rolls like waves against the vaulted ceiling. Here, marriages that were little more than business transactions were cloaked in sacred ritual. The clergy's blessing made these teenage unions not only legal, but holy, or at least that's how it was presented. Imagine a bishop, heavy in gold embroidery, lifting his hands over a pair of trembling children who barely knew each other's names. He intoned Latin prayers they couldn't fully understand, while the congregation murmured Amen, as though this solemn ritual erased all doubts about age or readiness. The bride, cheeks flushed, might not even have hit her 15th birthday. The groom, sometimes only slightly older, stared at the floor with an expression somewhere between terror and boredom. And yet the church declared them husband and wife, binding their futures with a sacramental seal. Canon law was clear on the minimum ages, girls at 12, boys at 14. These thresholds weren't random. They were tied to medieval understandings of puberty and maturity. The church insisted marriage was valid if the parties were physically capable of consummation, even if their minds were nowhere near ready. Historians still argue whether bishops truly believed this was divinely ordained, or if they simply turned a blind eye to political and financial convenience. After all, who was going to tell a king his daughter wasn't old enough to marry? Not a career-conscious priest. The quirky part is that in practice, ceremonies varied wildly. Some weddings were elaborate affairs with choirs, relics, and processions. Others were private, sometimes performed in bedchambers themselves. Yes, there are accounts of marriages solemnized with the couple already tucked beneath embroidered sheets, while the priest gave his blessing at the bedside. It's hard to say whether the teenagers in question found this comforting or just confusing. You probably wouldn't survive having your wedding officiated while sitting in pajamas, but for them, it was considered perfectly legitimate. Of course, the clergy weren't entirely blind. Some churchmen expressed unease at the practice. Confessors occasionally recorded young brides whispering about fears they couldn't name. One priest wrote of a 13-year-old duchess who wept through her vows, her tears dripping onto the altar cloth. Did he intervene? No, he simply noted it in his diary like a weather report. That's the gentle absurdity of medieval morality, a deep awareness of suffering paired with a shrug. And yet the church also offered loopholes. Couples could be betrothed as children but wait years before consummation. Technically, consummation was what truly made a marriage indissoluble. So some noble families staged the wedding early but postponed the final step until the bride reached a safer age. Of course, safer was relative. 15 was often considered mature enough. You can picture those anxious courtiers calculating on their fingers, whispering, "Just 2 more years and then the alliance will be sealed for good." The sacraments added layers of ceremony that distracted from the blunt reality. Hymns soared, candles flickered, and guests wept as though they were witnessing divine love, when in truth they were watching dynastic strategy dressed up in robes of holiness. The irony? Priests would later lecture about marital harmony and Christian love to couples who were barely old enough to comprehend the catechism. What makes the whole scene even stranger is how often these unions were celebrated in public festivals. Townspeople lined the streets to watch parades of children dressed like adults. Bread and wine flowed, and fireworks exploded as though the crowd had forgotten the couple could barely order a meal by themselves. To the public eye, the union was proof that God smiled upon the realm. To the couple, it was likely bewildering, even frightening. So, as you stand in that cathedral, incense curling toward the rafters, you realize that the clergy's blessing was the velvet glove over an iron reality. The church sanctified marriages that were primarily about land, wealth, and heirs. For every teenager forced to repeat vows in Latin, there was a priest assuring them that this was God's will. And you, standing in the pews, might whisper the question no one dared to ask aloud: was this truly holy, or just a convenient mask for dynastic ambition? The cathedral bells fade, and you find yourself following a narrow stairwell into the dim quarters of a private chamber. Here, the ritual grandeur of the church gives way to something starkly human: the reality of teenage brides becoming mothers before they were even old enough to properly understand what motherhood meant. Picture a girl of 14, her body barely settled into adolescence, now swollen with pregnancy. She sits by a cold hearth, one hand on her belly, the other nervously tracing the embroidery on her gown. Outside, the court whispers impatiently, would she deliver a boy, and quickly? Because a boy meant security, while a girl meant disappointment and the need to try again. You probably wouldn't survive that kind of pressure, even with modern prenatal care, let alone in a castle where medicine often meant herbs, prayers, and the occasional leech. One famous case is Margaret Beaufort, whom we mentioned earlier. She gave birth at 13 to Henry Tudor, who would later become Henry VII. Margaret nearly died in that childbirth and remained physically frail for the rest of her life. Historians still argue whether her survival was sheer luck, divine providence, or the quiet skill of the midwives who attended her. Either way, her story was not rare. Many young aristocratic mothers left childbirth broken, if not buried. The mortality rates were brutal. A teenage bride might produce an heir, but she risked her own life with each pregnancy. Some noble families essentially gambled with their daughters, knowing the stakes but proceeding anyway. And the cruel irony: if the girl died, the husband often remarried almost immediately, sometimes to another equally young bride, resetting the cycle as though nothing had happened. There were quirky medical ideas too about how to keep young mothers safe. Medieval physicians advised avoiding emotional disturbances during pregnancy, which is a polite way of saying that no one should upset the girl. Yet at the same time, these girls were often dragged into long court feasts, political disputes, and public appearances, their bodies treated as both fragile and indestructible. One 15th century manual even suggested giving pregnant teenagers diluted wine as a health tonic because apparently Nothing said safe pregnancy like alcohol. And then there were the babies. Picture a 16-year-old duchess cradling an infant in her arms while she herself still looked like a child. Servants stood ready to whisk the baby away to a wet nurse, while tutors began planning his education before he could crawl. The young mother, often sidelined, praised for her role as a vessel, but rarely treated as a parent in her own right. Historians still debate whether this sidelining was deliberate disempowerment or simply part of a broader aristocratic tradition where children were raised communally. Occasionally things turned tragic in ways that pierced even the toughest of courts. Chroniclers recorded queens who wept openly when their children were taken from them to be raised elsewhere. One Spanish princess reportedly sent secret letters to her nurse, begging for updates about her baby because her own husband refused to let her see the child. You can almost hear the scratch of her quill, the ink blotting with tears, her words half childlike, half regal. And yet amidst the grief there were also rare stories of joy. Some teenage brides bonded fiercely with their children, carving out maternal authority despite court politics. In one unusual case, a 15-year-old duchess in Burgundy insisted on personally nursing her baby, scandalizing courtiers who believed such duties were beneath her rank. But her act became legendary, whispered about as evidence of true affection in a world where affection was secondary. Still, for most, motherhood was less about nurturing and more about obligation. You can imagine the exhausting rhythm: marry young, bear children young, recover barely, and then do it again. Every banquet toast and every priest's blessing disguised the risk, the quiet possibility that the bride would not live to see her 20th birthday. So, when you peer into that chamber with its flickering hearth, you see not just a girl turned mother, but a fragile figure carrying the crushing weight of dynasties. She rocks her infant, whispers lullabies in a voice still girlish, and knows that tomorrow the court will demand she start the cycle again. You step out of that chamber, the echoes of lullabies still clinging to the stone, and wander into a training yard where the atmosphere shifts. Here, instead of fragile girls turned into mothers, you see noble boys being hurried into adulthood just as awkwardly, though with a very different set of expectations. Picture a lanky 15-year-old son of a duke, shoulders not yet broad, still fumbling with the straps of his armor. His voice cracks mid-command, and he can't grow a proper moustache, but already he's a husband on parchment. Aristocratic sons were often betrothed almost as young as their sisters, though the consummation might be delayed. A boy of 12 could be married by proxy, with a stand-in bride present at the ceremony, while he carried on with hunting lessons and falconry as though nothing had changed. You probably wouldn't survive the paperwork alone. Imagine being legally bound to a spouse while still struggling with your Latin homework. Still, noble boys weren't entirely spared from pressure. Families expected them to embody dynastic ambition just as much as their brides did. By their mid-teens, they were paraded through court as men, even if they hadn't quite earned the title. One quirky tidbit: some boys were coached by older knights on how to be a husband, which often meant little more than clumsy advice about being firm and producing heirs. It was less marriage counseling, more livestock manual. The mismatch was glaring when the husband was a teenager too. Some unions paired a 14-year-old groom with a 13-year-old bride, two children, trying to perform adulthood under the scrutiny of entire kingdoms. In some cases, the boy was as bewildered as the girl. Chroniclers noted that Edward III of England married Philippa of Hainault at 14. Though he grew into a formidable king, at the time he was just a boy in a velvet doublet, nervously reciting vows while adults cheered. Historians still argue whether these marriages were truly consummated immediately or delayed until the boy matured, but the fact remains they were thrust into roles they barely understood. When boys were married to older women, though, yes, it happened occasionally. The spectacle was even stranger. An adolescent husband might be paired with a widow twice his age, her dowry already secured, her experience overwhelming. Imagine a 15-year-old nobleman being told he was now the lord of an estate and a husband to a 30-year-old baroness who had already buried 2 husbands. The poor boy probably just wanted to ride his horse in peace. The court, however, demanded performance. Teenage husbands were expected to carry themselves with dignity, make public appearances, and speak as if they had the wisdom of seasoned rulers. They signed documents, dispensed favors, and presided over banquets, often guided by tutors, whispering instructions behind their shoulders. And when it came to private duties, well, let's just say those same tutors discreetly avoided offering too much advice. The oddest part, despite the pressure, boys had more leeway than girls. If they struggled to produce heirs immediately, the blame rarely fell on them. People would mutter about the bride's health or the alignment of the stars, not the husband's youth. You can almost hear the sighs of relief from those pimply teenage lords who dodged scrutiny while their wives bore the brunt of expectation. Yet there were moments of rebellion. Some noble boys dragged their feet about marriages arranged for them. In one case, a young heir allegedly faked illness to delay his wedding procession, hiding in his chamber until officials practically dragged him out. Was it nerves? Was it resistance? Historians debate whether these stunts were acts of childish fear or subtle protests against dynastic control. Still, more often than not, noble sons surrendered to their roles. They rode through tournaments to display their strength, they toasted at feasts as miniature patriarchs, and they learned quickly that a teenage marriage wasn't about love, it was about inheritance, survival, and reputation. So, as you watch that lanky 15-year-old groom adjust his ill-fitting armor and glance nervously toward a bride he barely knows, you realize the absurdity was universal. Boys and girls alike were pressed into marriages that treated their youth as expendable. The only difference was that he had a sword strapped to his hip, while she bore the heavier, invisible weight of carrying the dynasty within her body. The clatter of the training yard fades, and now you find yourself crossing seas, not literally, but in the imagination of this sleepy history wonder. While Europe often gets the spotlight for teenage marriages, you realize aristocratic unions across the globe carried their own peculiarities. Tonight you peer into India, China, and the Middle East, where young brides and grooms were similarly treated as chess pieces in dynastic games, but the cultural rituals and justifications took on different colors and textures. In India, the spectacle of aristocratic child marriages was woven tightly with caste, honor, and dynastic prestige. Royal families arranged marriages for girls sometimes before they turned 10, sealing alliances that stretched across provinces. You probably wouldn't survive sitting through the lengthy Sanskrit ceremonies filled with chanting priests, garlands of marigolds, and endless offerings of clarified butter to sacred fires. But to families at the time, the ritual was everything. A girl in jeweled anklets, her arms painted with henna, might be married off to a man twice her age, or more. Historians still argue whether such unions were immediately consummated or deferred, but the social pressure was clear. The earlier the tie was made, the safer the dynasty's grip. China carried its own elaborate traditions. In imperial courts, noble daughters were pawns in clan strategies, but the Confucian ideal of filial duty gave everything a gloss of moral obligation. A girl of 13 might be dressed in silks and carried in a palanquin to her husband's household, where firecrackers burst in the streets, and scrolls recorded her entry as though a new star had entered the heavens. Quirky detail. Sometimes ghost marriages were arranged, where a deceased son was married symbolically to a living girl, binding 2 families together, even in the absence of an actual groom. Imagine being a teenager told that your husband was already dead, but that you still had to join his household, live as his widow, and uphold the family honor. Romance rating, 0 out of 10. And then in the Middle East, particularly under dynasties like the Abbasids and Ottomans, marriages often merged religious legitimacy with political maneuvering. Teenage brides were not unusual, especially among sultans and caliphs. The harem wasn't simply a place of sensuality, as popular imagination paints it, but a complex political arena where young women, often teenagers, were elevated as consorts or mothers of heirs. Some, like Hurrem Sultan in the Ottoman court, rose to extraordinary power, though she herself entered palace life in her teens. You can almost picture her walking barefoot across tiled courtyards, her fate intertwined with an empire's politics. Historians debate whether harems confined women or gave them platforms for influence. In either case, age was no barrier to being thrust into those roles. Even further afield, among nomadic aristocracies in Central Asia, alliances were sealed by marrying daughters off as soon as they reach puberty. A girl might still be learning how to tend sheep, but once her father spotted a political advantage, she was packed onto a horse and sent across the steppe to a new family. Picture the wide, windswept grasslands, a caravan of riders bearing a girl wrapped in furs, heading toward a groom she had never met. What unites all these examples is the same core truth. Teenage bodies became the fabric of political strategy. Yet the cultural trappings differed. In Europe, the church sprinkled holy water. In India, priests circled sacred fires. In China, ancestors were invoked. In the Middle East, imams recited blessings. Each culture wrapped the transaction in sacred or symbolic ritual, as if to disguise the blunt reality that children were being converted into dynastic glue. The quirky similarities are uncanny, though. Everywhere, people used food to celebrate the unions. Roasted lamb in Ottoman feasts, spiced rice in Indian palaces, elaborate pastries in French courts, because nothing says these kids are now married like too much food. And everywhere, art depicted these teenagers as mature, idealized adults, smoothing over the awkward truth that the bride was still young enough to play with dolls. You stand back, seeing these global variations unfold like a tapestry. Different colors, different stitches, but the same underlying pattern. Families desperate to survive, dynasties hungry for security, and teenagers pressed into roles that cared little for their own wishes. Whether in a Parisian cathedral, a Mughal courtyard, or a Beijing palace, the story rhymed across continents. The vision of foreign palaces fades, and now you find yourself hunched over a wooden table littered with scrolls, ink pots, and quills. The torches flicker, casting long shadows across parchment that smells faintly of dust and candle smoke. You're in the archive now, the place where the truth of aristocratic marriages reveals itself, not in romantic letters, but in ledgers that read more like business contracts than vows of affection. Picture a clerk in a cramped chamber scratching away with ink-stained fingers. He isn't writing about the bride's beauty or the groom's courage. He's itemizing acres, vineyards, and livestock. The dowry shall include 3 estates, 1 hunting forest, and a yearly delivery of 500 barrels of wine. That's not a love poem. That's a medieval grocery list. You probably wouldn't survive the boredom of reading through 50 of these contracts, but for the families involved, every clause was as binding as iron. Sometimes the negotiations dragged on for years. Ambassadors shuttled back and forth between courts, wrangling over whether a certain castle came with its surrounding farmland or not. One quirky tidbit. In 15th century France, an entire argument broke out over whether the bride's dowry included the family's falconry birds. Imagine nobles sitting around a table, red-faced, quarrelling over hawks while a teenage girl sat silently in the corner, her future sealed by the outcome. And it wasn't just land and animals. Sometimes debts were folded into the deal. A bankrupt noble might marry his daughter off to a wealthier house in exchange for a bailout. The marriage contract became a receipt. I give you my child, you erase my debts. Historians still argue whether such unions rescued families or simply transferred misfortune from one branch of the tree to another. Either way, the girl became collateral. If you expect secret love letters tucked among these parchments, you'll be disappointed. Most records sound cold, legalistic, and painfully unromantic. The only flourishes were the grandiose titles, Most Illustrious Lord, Duke of this and that, Knight of the Order of the Golden Fleece, followed by bullet points on who owed whom what. The bride's name was often squeezed between clauses, almost an afterthought. Occasionally, though, emotion slipped through. A nobleman might write of his great satisfaction at securing the alliance, or a father might express his hope for harmony and many children. It wasn't love, it was optimism couched in the polite language of finance. And sometimes, when negotiations soured, the bitterness was just as formal. Entire contracts fell apart because one family refused to hand over a specific village, leaving the bride stranded between betrothal and abandonment. These documents also reveal how marriages were safeguarded legally. Clauses protected dowries from being squandered. If the husband died, the wife was supposed to retain certain lands as her widow's portion. At least on parchment, girls weren't entirely powerless. In reality, of course, enforcement depended on who held the bigger army. You can imagine a widowed teenager clutching her contract and insisting on her rights, while her in-laws eyed her estate like hungry wolves. There's even a humorous edge in some cases. One Italian contract specified that if the groom insulted the bride in public, he would forfeit part of his dowry back to her family. That's right. Early prenup clauses included a medieval version of "don't be a jerk." You probably wish modern relationships had such clear penalties written into law. And yet what's most striking is how impersonal the contracts feel. They reduce human lives to numbers and obligations, as though teenagers weren't people but assets. Behind each parchment lies a girl biting her lip in anxiety, a boy fidgeting with his cuffs, and two families congratulating themselves on a deal well struck. So, as you shuffle through the imaginary stacks of parchment tonight, you realize the true love letters of aristocracy weren't scented with perfume or sealed with kisses. They were weighed down with wax seals, stamped with crests, and filed away in dusty chests where ink on parchment mattered more than any fluttering heart. The parchment crackles in your hands, and as you set it aside, the image shifts again. You're now in a noble household study, shelves lined with manuscripts, tutors murmuring Latin conjugations to rows of restless pupils. But notice who isn't here, the teenage daughters. Their seats are empty. For noble girls, education was a privilege that often ended the moment marriage contracts began. You picture a girl of 12 diligently reciting Cicero or practicing her lute, only to have her governess pull her aside and whisper, "Your lessons will pause now. You're to be prepared for your wedding." That meant her books were shelved in favor of embroidery needles, her music exchanged for lessons in household management, and her future narrowed to maternity. Historians still argue whether noble women who received full educations were exceptions, or whether we've simply overlooked how many of them existed in the shadows of history. But one thing is clear, marriage often interrupted learning at its most crucial stage. The quirky twist is that some parents tried to cram education into the tiny window before marriage. Girls of 10 or 11 might be rushed through Latin, arithmetic, or etiquette lessons, their tutors treating them like intellectual sponges about to be squeezed dry. Imagine being handed a stack of Virgil and a wedding dress in the same week. You probably wouldn't survive the whiplash. There are examples, though, of girls who managed to hang on to their intellectual pursuits. Elizabeth of York, mother of Henry VIII, was praised for her learning, though her education was more domestic than scholarly. Meanwhile, Catherine of Aragon, married at 15, was unusually well-schooled in Latin, philosophy, and theology, thanks to her formidable mother, Isabella of Castile. She brought her books to England, a quiet rebellion against the expectation that queens should stick to childbearing and embroidery. Still, most teenage brides were steered away from study. Their new roles demanded different skills: how to manage servants, how to present themselves at court, how to host banquets without fainting from nerves. Picture a tutor patiently demonstrating how to fold linen napkins into swans, while the girl's unfinished Latin grammar sat abandoned in the corner. Scholarly debate was replaced by discussions of dowries, fertility, and etiquette manuals that instructed her on how to walk 3 paces behind her husband. The irony is that education didn't disappear completely, it was simply redirected. Girls were taught the art of diplomacy, but in coded, silent ways. They learned when to smile, when to remain silent, and when to flatter a foreign ambassador. In that sense, their curriculum was survival in a courtly jungle. And while boys scribbled essays on Aristotle, girls scribbled nervous drafts of letters to in-laws they hadn't met yet. One quirky tidbit: Some noble brides were trained in music specifically to impress their husbands. A girl might be given a lute or a harp and told to practice endlessly, not because she enjoyed it, but because a charming song at the wedding feast could make her seem more desirable. Think of it as the medieval equivalent of a talent show audition, except the prize wasn't a trophy, it was a lifetime of dynastic obligation. Yet there were also sparks of resistance. Some girls secretly continued reading after marriage, coaxing sympathetic priests or monks to lend them books. A few even became patrons of scholars, channeling their curiosity into supporting learning they themselves had been denied. Historians debate whether this subtle rebellion had long-term impact, but it certainly gave us the occasional bright light of learned queens and duchesses who defied the stereotype. So as you stand in that half-empty classroom tonight, you hear the muffled echoes of what might have been. The pages never turned, the songs never finished, the equations never solved. Teenage girls traded their education for maternity gowns, their pens for prayer books, their curiosity for duty. And while some left faint traces of brilliance, most had their intellectual promise quietly folded away like parchment in a locked chest. You drift from the abandoned classroom into another chamber, dimly lit where the smell of herbs and candle smoke hangs thick in the air. This is the birthing room, the place where teenage brides faced the harshest test of all. The laughter of feasts, the clinking of goblets, the pages of contracts, all of it fades when a young girl lies sweating on linen sheets, praying she survives the night. Imagine a 15-year-old duchess gripping the carved edge of a wooden bed as midwives bustle around her, their aprons stained from countless other births. Outside, men pace anxiously, calculating what the child's gender will mean for treaties and inheritances. Inside, it's all about survival. You probably wouldn't survive either, because even with modern medicine, childbirth is terrifying, let alone in a cold medieval chamber with only herbs, whispered prayers, and a bucket of water for comfort. The statistics were grim. Maternal mortality in the Middle Ages was shockingly high, and for teenage mothers it was even worse. Their bodies were still developing, their bones not fully grown. Narrow pelvises led to obstructed labor, hemorrhage, and infections. Some girls never made it past their first delivery, leaving behind grieving parents, or perhaps just political headaches. Historians still argue whether noble families downplayed these risks out of ignorance or deliberate denial, but the pattern is impossible to ignore. Dynastic ambition trumped personal safety. Quirky remedies were everywhere. Midwives sprinkled holy water on the sheets, priests held relics over the laboring girl, and herbalists offered concoctions of rue, pennyroyal, and wine. One particularly bizarre medieval belief claimed that placing an eagle stone under the mattress would ease childbirth. You can almost picture the desperate midwife rummaging for magical rocks while the bride screamed in pain. Science? Not exactly. And then there was the silence afterward. If the child was born healthy, bells rang, and servants ran through the corridors announcing the good news. If it was a boy, the father's chest swelled with pride, and wine flowed in the great hall. If it was a girl, the celebration was more muted, a polite clapping of hands, a few reluctant smiles, then a quiet sigh. "We'll try again soon." And if the mother died, a few prayers, a black cloth over the doorway, and then within months often plans for a new marriage. The coldness of it is enough to make you shiver. Not every story was tragic, though. Some teenage brides proved remarkably resilient. Eleanor of Aquitaine married young, gave birth to multiple children, and lived into her 80s, a rare example of survival and influence. She travelled across Europe, defied kings, and left her mark on history. But for every Eleanor, there were dozens of Margarets and Isabellas whose names barely survive, remembered only in family trees. That note: married at 14, died in childbirth at 16. One of the oddest practices was the presence of entire audiences during royal births. Queens were expected to deliver heirs in semi-public, with noble women crowding the chamber to serve as witnesses, ensuring no baby swap or fraud took place. Imagine being a frightened 15-year-old labouring in agony while half the court stared at you like an anxious jury. You probably wouldn't survive the stage fright. never mind the childbirth itself. The scholarly debate continues about how much agency these young brides had in matters of health. Some suggest they learned to negotiate, demanding longer recovery times or better treatment. Others argue they were little more than passengers in a process they couldn't control. Either way, their bodies bore the cost of dynastic ambition, and too often the payment was their lives. So when you linger in that chamber, hearing the muffled cries of labor, the smell of herbs and sweat hanging heavy, you understand the raw, unvarnished truth. Aristocrats married teenagers not just to sign treaties or parade dowries, but to gamble on fertility, and the stakes were life and death. The cries of childbirth fade, and you drift into a quieter corner of the castle gardens where gossip thrives like ivy on the stone walls. Here, among fountains and rose bushes, you overhear the rare, scandalous tales of teenage brides who dared to resist. Most were silent, accepting their lot with folded hands and lowered eyes, but every so often one of them broke the script, and history preserved the shock of it. One such figure was Joan of Navarre, who, though married at a young age, was said to have insisted on negotiating her own terms with her husband. Instead of meekly agreeing, she reportedly demanded concessions, making her marriage less a surrender and more a partnership. Historians still argue whether she truly had that much influence, or if later chroniclers exaggerated her boldness, but the fact remains, her name carries a faint scent of rebellion. There were also those who flat out refused. Records exist of noble girls pleading in tears not to marry, even attempting to flee. A quirky example comes from 15th century Italy, where a young noblewoman is said to have locked herself in a tower to avoid a marriage her family arranged. Did she succeed? Only temporarily. Eventually, her relatives dragged her down, wedding dress waiting. You probably wouldn't survive that kind of family pressure. Even your most dramatic teenage tantrum wouldn't compare. In some courts, scandalous exceptions happened when teenage brides fell in love elsewhere. Chronicles whisper of girls who developed affections for squires, tutors, or even ladies-in-waiting. These rumors were often exaggerated, fueled by envious courtiers or hostile chroniclers, but they show that desire and defiance existed beneath the rigid system. Love wasn't supposed to enter the story, yet it occasionally crept in through the cracks like weeds between cobblestones. And then there were annulments. If a girl refused to consummate her marriage, families sometimes sought to void the union, citing immaturity, illness, or, on rare occasions, her explicit refusal. Annulments weren't common, but they offered a glimpse of resistance. Catherine of Aragon's early marriage to Arthur, Prince of Wales, for instance, hinged on debates about whether the union had ever been consummated. Though Catherine was older than many teenage brides, the dispute reveals how fragile and contested these arrangements could be. Occasionally, teenage brides used religion as their shield. Some appealed to the church, claiming they felt a higher calling. A few even managed to enter convents instead of marriage. That option, however, was often reserved for second daughters, or those whose families couldn't afford a grand dowry. Still, it offered a way out, however narrow, from the suffocating expectations of marriage. And let's not forget the humour hidden in the archives. One chronicler recorded that a particularly headstrong bride openly mocked her groom's age at the altar, quipping that she would rather wed his horse. Did she get away with it? Barely. But it was written down because it was so shocking, proof that not all brides entered the role meekly. These stories are rare precisely because rebellion was dangerous. For most girls, resistance meant punishment, disgrace, or worse. A runaway bride wasn't romanticized. She was treated as a stain on her family's honor. The stakes were too high for most to even try. Yet the fact that any dared at all reminds you that behind the silks and contracts were real teenagers with their own wills, their own small acts of defiance, whether a sarcastic remark at the altar, a tear-streaked refusal, or a love scribbled secretly into the margins of a prayer book. So as you wander through this imaginary garden, hearing the faint giggles of court gossipers and the whispers of rebellious hearts, you realize that aristocratic teenage marriages weren't always perfectly executed transactions. Sometimes the system cracked, Sometimes the teenagers reminded everyone, if only for a moment, that they were more than pawns, that they could resist, however briefly, the weight of dynastic chains. The rustle of gossip in the garden fades as you return to the echoing great halls, where politics and reality collided in stranger ways. Here you notice something peculiar. While kings often married teenage brides for alliances and fertility, their hearts and their beds were often elsewhere. Enter the world of royal mistresses, the secret and sometimes not-so-secret counterparts who complicated these already lopsided marriages. Picture the scene, a king in his 40s, newly wed to a bride of 13. At banquets he shows her off, her tiny hands weighed down with jewels, her smile rehearsed. Yet when the music fades and the torches are extinguished, the king wanders not to his bride's chamber, but to that of a mistress closer to his own age, or at least more attuned to his tastes. You probably wouldn't survive the awkwardness of such a triangle, with the whole court whispering behind embroidered sleeves, but for medieval aristocracy, this was business as usual. One infamous case is Charles II of England, who, though not medieval but later, kept a court full of mistresses even while married. Going back further, you find French kings like Francis the Chub, known as much for their love affairs as for their policies. Teenage brides were tokens of diplomacy, but mistresses often held the king's affection, sometimes even his ear, in matters of state. Historians still argue whether queens tolerated this quietly, or whether some wielded subtle forms of retaliation. The quirky detail is that mistresses often received more flattering attention than the legal wives. Artists painted them with sensuality, poets sang of their charms, while the queen, the child bride, was depicted as pious and dutiful. Imagine being 15 crowned with pearls, only to discover your husband's true passion was someone old enough to be your governess. Talk about adding insult to injury. Yet the system endured because it served both sides of dynastic ambition. The bride produced heirs, legitimate, unquestioned, stamped with the seal of dynasty. The mistress provided companionship, passion, and sometimes political intrigue. It was as if society agreed that no single woman could fulfill all roles, so kings maintained a dual system of wife and lover. The cruelty is obvious, but so is the strange logic. Occasionally, though, mistresses clashed with queens in spectacular fashion. Chroniclers tell of icy banquets where the two women sat at opposite ends of the table, both knowing who truly held the king's attention. One story claims that a young queen once burst into tears after catching her husband in the arms of his mistress, and instead of comforting her, courtiers scolded her for lacking dignity. You can almost hear the dry sarcasm of history. Dignity, apparently, meant ignoring betrayal while still attending mass together the next morning. Historians debate whether teenage brides ever found ways to compete. Some cultivated their own charm, learning to dance, sing, or dazzle ambassadors. Others leaned on religion, gaining respect through displays of piety. A few, like Catherine de' Medici, grew into formidable political figures, biding their time until widowhood gave them true power. But in their teenage years, most endured silently, overshadowed by mistresses who were celebrated as the real women in the king's life. One quirky tidbit, mistresses sometimes sat in on councils of state. Picture that. While the queen embroidered or prayed, the mistress was advising on wars and taxes. Imagine being the teenage queen in the next room, listening to laughter through the walls, realizing that her role was both exalted and hollow. You probably wouldn't survive the humiliation, though perhaps you'd be tempted to slip something into the mistress's wine. And so, as you linger in this hall where kings and queens dined under gilded ceilings, you see the strange divide. Teenage brides legitimized dynasties, but mistresses often ruled hearts and whispered into ears of power. It was a system that left the official queens draped in pearls but starved of affection, expected to smile while their husbands' true desires lay elsewhere. The echo of court whispers lingers, and now you find yourself wandering into a long gallery lined with portraits. The air smells faintly of varnish and dust, and dozens of painted eyes stare down at you. Here, aristocratic teenagers live forever, not as the fragile children they were, but as dignified matrons and solemn statesmen. Art, after all, had a job to do: erase awkward realities and present marriages as polished, respectable, and timeless. Take a closer look. A Duchess of 14 gazes out from her canvas, her cheeks powdered to hide pimples, her hair arranged in elaborate braids far too heavy for her small neck. Her hands are folded with unnatural grace, pearls dangling from her wrist. To you, she looks like a child trying on her mother's jewelry box. But to her contemporaries, this painting was propaganda, proof that she was a proper lady, fit to carry a dynasty forward. You probably wouldn't survive holding still that long for a portrait, especially with itchy brocade sleeves, but she sat patiently because her image was as important as her dowry. The quirky detail is that many of these portraits were sent ahead to prospective grooms. Before some teenage brides ever met their husbands, their painted likenesses travelled across borders. A king might squint at the canvas, nod approvingly, and declare he would marry the girl. Imagine your future being decided by how flattering the painter was feeling that day. If the artist exaggerated your nose or forgot to smooth your skin, your entire destiny could be altered. No pressure, right? Sometimes the deception was deliberate. A girl of 13 could be painted with the maturity of 20, her body elongated, her features softened. The portrait announced, "See, she's already a woman," even though she still giggled with her ladies-in-waiting about silly riddles. Historians still argue whether grooms were fooled or simply complicit in the charade, choosing to believe the brushstrokes rather than the truth. And it wasn't just brides. Teenage grooms, too, were painted as solemn lords, their chins lifted, their swords polished, their boyish awkwardness erased. One Italian portrait shows a 16-year-old duke with the gravitas of a seasoned commander, though in reality he was still sneaking off to play dice with his pages. You can almost hear him whisper to the artist, "Make me look taller." Yet for brides, the burden was heavier. Their portraits became public relations campaigns, symbols of their family's prestige. A girl's fertility, chastity, and suitability were all supposedly conveyed through the tilt of her head and the richness of her gown. One odd instruction to painters was to show brides with slightly rounded bellies, not because they were pregnant, but because plumpness symbolized health and fertility. Imagine being 13, posing while the artist subtly padded your waistline for political effect. These images also reinforced the myth of dignity. A girl who was terrified on her wedding night might appear serene on canvas, rosary in hand, eyes lifted toward heaven. A bride whose marriage contract read like a ransom note could be immortalized as the very picture of harmony. The paintings created a false memory that outlived the truth. Hundreds of years later, you and I peer at them and see elegance. But beneath the layers of oil paint there were trembling hands, fluttering hearts, and whispered fears. One quirky tidbit: sometimes brides were painted with symbolic animals. A dog at the hem of the gown meant loyalty. A lamb symbolized innocence. Yet the irony is glaring. A lamb painted beside a girl of 13 was less symbol than reality. She was a lamb, dressed up and sent to slaughter, though no one would dare phrase it that way. As you walk down the gallery surrounded by these frozen faces, you sense the weight of propaganda. Portraits didn't just decorate castles, they rewrote history in real time. They made teenage brides look like queens, child grooms look like kings, and dynastic contracts look like romances. And in their stillness, they buried the truth that these were children painted as adults, their fragility disguised beneath brushstrokes of dignity. The painted faces fade into the stone walls, and you drift into another hall, this one less ceremonial, more practical. Here you see long oak tables piled high with scrolls, coins, and signet rings where older men sit puffing on pipes or sipping wine while their young brides wait in silence. This is where the imbalance of power is at its starkest. The groom might be in his 40s, 50s, or even older, his beard streaked with grey, while the bride beside him is barely out of childhood. The arrangement wasn't accidental. Aristocrats often sought older husbands for teenage daughters precisely because age meant stability. A seasoned duke already controlled land, armies, and alliances. A young girl brought fresh fertility. ensuring heirs who could inherit without delay. Together they represented the brutal arithmetic of survival. His power, plus her youth, equaled dynasty secured. You probably wouldn't survive being in that dinner conversation. The generational gap would make even modern family reunions seem tame. Consider Isabella of Valois, married at 6 to King Richard II of England, who was 30. The marriage was never consummated, but it was paraded as a sign of peace between England and France. The sheer visual of a child queen sitting beside a grown king says everything about the imbalance. Historians still argue whether Richard's treatment of Isabella was unusually gentle or simply typical restraint until she was ready. But the fact that such restraint was needed speaks volumes. One quirky detail: some chroniclers openly joked about the age differences. A 15th-century French poet quipped about a teenage bride softening the wrinkles of her elderly husband. Imagine being immortalized in verse as little more than anti-aging cream for your spouse, not exactly the stuff of love songs. And the power imbalance extended beyond the bedchamber. A teenage bride had little say in how her household was run. Her husband might be decades her senior, steeped in politics, trained in war, and fluent in multiple languages, while she was still learning how to keep her veil from slipping. He dictated alliances, expenditures, even the way she presented herself in public. Her role was ceremonial, until it became biological. Occasionally, though, the imbalance produced strange outcomes. An older husband might die quickly, leaving his teenage widow suddenly powerful. Picture a 14-year-old girl, newly widowed, technically in charge of vast estates. Courtiers circled like vultures, suitors lined up for remarriage negotiations, and yet, for a fleeting moment, she held more independence than she'd ever known. Some widowed teenage queens, like Mary of Burgundy, wielded that unexpected authority with surprising skill. Others were quickly married off again, their brief taste of autonomy extinguished. The imbalance also created gossip fodder. Courtiers whispered when an older husband failed to produce heirs with his young wife. Whose fault was it? The bride, supposedly too green, or the groom, perhaps past his prime? You can almost hear the whispers echoing through candlelit corridors, every miscarriage, every delay in pregnancy, fueling speculation. In reality, many older husbands struggled with fertility, but society rarely placed blame on them. Instead, the pressure returned to the girl. And then there's the image of the wedding night. A teenage bride shaking beneath brocade sheets beside a man old enough to be her father, or sometimes her grandfather. Was she comforted, terrified, resigned? Historians debate whether some grooms waited years or seized their rights immediately. The truth is buried under centuries of silence, but the imbalance speaks louder than any record. So as you sit in that hall, watching an older man sip wine while his bride twiddles nervously with the ribbon on her sleeve, you see the uncomfortable reality. The marriage wasn't a partnership, it was an equation. Age equaled power, youth equaled fertility, and the girl's voice was the missing variable. Her life bent to his will, while the dynastic machinery churned around her. And though portraits and poets tried to make it seem elegant, the truth was plain. These marriages weren't about love or equality. They were about one side holding the sword, the estate, the council seat, and the other holding nothing but expectation. The clink of goblets and the heavy sighs of old men fade as you make your way into the quieter accounting chambers of the castle. Dusty rooms where stewards tally debts, scratch notes into ledgers, and whisper about dowries that could make or break a family. Here, the romance of noble weddings dissolves entirely, and what remains is cold arithmetic. You see a girl of 13, hair carefully braided, sitting stiffly while her father and uncles argue with a groom's representatives. They aren't discussing her favorite color, or whether she prefers hunting or embroidery. No, they're haggling over money. Her dowry is the buy-in, and her new husband's wealth, or lack of it, determines whether this union is salvation or ruin. You probably wouldn't survive the boredom of these negotiations, though the stakes were higher than any poker game. Sometimes marriages were arranged precisely because a noble family had debts. In 15th century Italy, for instance, bankers often stepped in to arrange advantageous matches that would allow a struggling duke to pay off his creditors. A quirky tidbit: some contracts explicitly listed outstanding loans to be absorbed into the marriage agreement. So, in effect, a teenage bride wasn't just a daughter, she was a bailout package with a pulse. And when things went wrong, the fallout could be dramatic. There are stories of noblemen marrying wealthy young brides only to squander the dowries on gambling, tournaments, or lavish feasts. Families sometimes sued to reclaim the money, dragging teenage wives into humiliating court cases. Historians still argue whether these lawsuits were more about protecting daughters or clawing back wealth, but either way, the marriages themselves became tangled in endless disputes. Picture the awkwardness: a 16-year-old duchess sitting in a court chamber while her father accuses her husband of mismanaging her dowry, and her husband shouts back that the estates were barren anyway. She sits between them, silent, realizing she is both the cause and the collateral. You can almost feel the tension, heavy as the oak beams above her head. The imbalance wasn't just between families, it also lay within them. Some fathers saw their daughters as bargaining chips to repair their own misfortunes. In France, during the 100 Years' War, there were cases of noblemen marrying daughters to creditors as a way of erasing debts. Imagine the dinner conversation when your new father-in-law used your marriage as shorthand for paid in full. One curious case from Spain tells of a nobleman who married his 14-year-old daughter to a wealthy merchant, not because the match was prestigious, but because the merchant agreed to cover the family's military expenses. That girl went from embroidering handkerchiefs to being the invisible price tag on a set of armored horses. And of course, if debts couldn't be managed, things turned uglier still. Families sometimes married daughters off hastily to avoid losing lands entirely. The desperation shows in the contracts, which list hurriedly promised vineyards, forests, or castles. The bride herself barely mentioned, except as the vessel carrying the family name into someone else's ledger. The irony is that these unions, meant to solve financial crises, often created new ones. The husband's family might resent supporting their new wife's bankrupt kin. The wife's relatives might push for more gifts to cover lingering debts. Before long, alliances soured, and whispers spread through court about which families had overextended themselves. The teenage bride was caught in the middle, her future shackled not to love, but to an unpaid bill. Yet not all was bleak. Occasionally, a debt-ridden marriage turned unexpectedly well. A wealthy bride might genuinely enjoy her new role, or a once bankrupt husband might rise to prominence thanks to her estates. In those rare cases, people retroactively painted the union as fate, glossing over the fact it began as a desperate bargain. Still, as you sit in that dim chamber, surrounded by parchment and coins, you hear the truth beneath the scratching quills. Teenage brides were often married not for alliance or affection, but for balance sheets. Their bodies were collateral, their signatures currency, and their marriages little more than dynastic IOUs dressed up in satin gowns. The dust of the account book settles, and your steps carry you into a chamber filled with maps, broad tables covered in vellum, where nobles move carved figurines like generals at war. Here, marriages weren't just about paying debts, they were chess moves, each teenage bride or groom a piece on the board of European politics. Picture an ambassador in rich velvet robes leaning over a map of Europe. He points to Burgundy, then to England, then to Castile, explaining how the marriage of one 14-year-old girl will create a bridge of peace between rival kingdoms. The irony is thick. Armies might clash for decades, but one teenager's womb was supposed to settle everything. You probably wouldn't survive the pressure of being compared to a fortification or a trade route, but that's how dynasties saw their children, strategic assets. The most famous examples read like epic sagas. Margaret of Anjou, married at 15 to Henry VI of England, was not chosen for her beauty or wit, but because her union cemented a fragile truce in the 100 Years' War. Historians still argue whether she brought peace or merely delayed the inevitable, but one thing is certain: her teenage marriage shaped the future of nations. quirky detail? Some alliances were so desperate that families married children by proxy, with stand-ins reciting vows in their stead. Imagine a wax effigy or a cousin representing you at your own wedding while you were still learning to write your name. Later, you'd be shipped off to meet your spouse, sometimes years after the paperwork was signed. Modern long-distance relationships have nothing on that. And then there was the Habsburg family, practically the poster children for political matchmaking. They married their teenagers across Europe with such frequency that people joked their family motto was, "Let others wage war. You, lucky Austria, marry." One archduchess of barely 15 might be married off to Spain, another to Bohemia, and soon the entire map glittered with Habsburg alliances. Their empire wasn't built only with swords, it was stitched together by bridal veils. The chess game logic wasn't limited to Europe. Remember those examples from India and China? Similar strategies played out there too, with aristocratic daughters sealing alliances between rival houses. In the Ottoman Empire, sultans married teenage princesses from neighboring realms to prevent wars, or sometimes to justify them when those unions failed. For the teenagers themselves, the political stakes were terrifying. Imagine being told that if you failed to produce an heir, a fragile truce might collapse into war. One young French princess reportedly wept for hours before being shipped to Spain, fearing that her body carried the peace of two kingdoms. That's not just pressure, that's geopolitical blackmail disguised as matrimony. And yet sometimes the marriages worked, at least politically. A successful union could quiet border disputes, strengthen trade, and bolster legitimacy. Court poets praised these brides as angels of peace, draped in silk, leading knights and merchants to lay down their arms. The reality, of course, was less angelic. Behind the scenes, ambassadors still schemed, kings still sharpened swords, and the poor teenager was often left lonely in a foreign land, missing her mother. Historians still debate how much personal agency these brides had. Some argue they were pawns, powerless in the game of dynasties. Others note that once queens, many learned to maneuver within court politics, using their precarious positions to influence diplomacy. Take Catherine de' Medici, married off at 14, but later one of the most powerful figures in France. What began as a chess move turned her into a queen with her own agenda. So as you lean over that table, watching nobles shuffle figurines across maps, you understand the chilling logic. Aristocrats married teenagers not because they believed in young love, but because kingdoms were easier to tie together with silk ribbons than with endless war. Each pawn was a daughter or son, each alliance sealed with vows, and each fragile teenage body became the hinge upon which nations turned. The maps and figurines dissolve into the glow of torches, and now you find yourself swept into the heart of a wedding feast. The great hall is alive with the clamour of trumpets, the rattle of dice, and the clinking of pewter goblets. The air is thick with roasted meat, cinnamon, and spilled ale. Here, marriage isn't just an alliance or a contract, it's a festival of fertility, and the symbolism is almost embarrassingly direct. Picture the bride, a girl of 13, cheeks pink with both nerves and rouge. She is led to the high table, where nobles lift their cups and toast her ripeness. Yes, that's the word, ripeness. The hall roars with laughter as men twice her age joke about harvests and vineyards, pretending these metaphors soften the reality that everyone is waiting for her to produce heirs. You probably wouldn't survive such a feast without rolling your eyes hard enough to scandalize half the court. The quirky detail is how fertility rituals were baked, sometimes literally, into the feast. In France, it was common to serve pies stuffed with live birds which would burst out when cut, symbolizing abundance. In England, spiced bride ale was brewed, the word eventually evolving into bridal. Guests would sip the drink while chanting blessings for many sons. And in Italy, almonds, symbols of fertility, were handed out like candy. Imagine tossing handfuls of nuts at a shy teenager as though that would guarantee dynastic success. Music filled every corner. Minstrels sang bawdy ballads that hinted not so subtly at what would happen in the bedchamber later. Some German courts even staged mock fertility plays with actors dressed as Adam and Eve prancing around to remind everyone what the night's goal really was. Subtlety, as you can tell, was not the strong suit of medieval aristocracy. And then there was the bedding ceremony. Yes, that was a thing. In some regions, the bride and groom were escorted to their chamber by a noisy crowd of guests who placed them in bed together while making rowdy jokes. Sometimes the priest himself offered a final blessing over the sheets. Privacy? Forget it. The entire community participated as though ensuring fertility was everyone's responsibility. Historians still argue whether the bedding was purely symbolic or whether some couples were expected to, shall we say, demonstrate readiness before witnesses. Either way, you wouldn't survive the stage fright. Of course, the feast wasn't all crude symbolism. There were moments of genuine splendor. Tables groaned under the weight of roasted swan, gilded pastries, and sugared fruits shipped from far-off lands. Guests marveled at sugar sculptures shaped like castles or unicorns. For a few hours, the teenage bride was a queen, toasted by all, her future seemingly bright beneath the glow of candles and laughter. But beneath the spectacle, the pressure remained constant. Every cheer, every toast, every bite of sweetmeat was laced with expectation. Bear children, secure the line, prove the alliance. If the bride blushed, people whispered it was a good omen. If she looked pale, they muttered about weakness. Imagine being judged by how gracefully you nibbled a goose leg in front of 300 nobles. Quirky customs varied across regions. In some German towns, newlyweds were forced to eat an egg together without using their hands because eggs symbolized fertility. In Poland, guests threw wheat at the couple, showering them like modern rice. In Scandinavia, the bride's shoes were stolen and ransomed back by the groom, symbolizing his ability to provide. All of it was meant to mask the anxiety of dynasties with laughter and spectacle. As the night wore on, the hall grew hazy with smoke and song. Somewhere in the noise, a nervous teenage bride sat, nodding politely, her stomach twisting with fear about what awaited her when the candles burned low. The guests toasted, jesters danced, and the celebration thundered on, oblivious to the fact that the girl at the center of it all was still a child, dressed up as a symbol of fertility and dynastic continuity. So when you sit quietly in a corner of that hall watching the feasting, you see more than just merriment. You see the weight of history in every toast, the desperation of dynasties hidden beneath pies and ale, and the fragile figure of a teenager transformed into the embodiment of a family's future. The clamor of the wedding feast lingers in your ears, but as the laughter fades, you slip away into a quieter side chapel of the castle. The air is cool here, heavy with incense, and a confessor sits waiting in a carved wooden booth. This is where the teenage bride, weighed down with silk and secrets, might whisper her fears. For the priests, it was a dilemma. How to reconcile sacred vows with the confessions of children thrust into roles they could barely comprehend. Imagine a 13-year-old queen kneeling, fingers trembling on her rosary, whispering that she dreads her husband's approach. The confessor listens, his face hidden by shadows, offering platitudes about duty, obedience, and God's will. You probably wouldn't survive being told that your teenage anxieties were divine obligations, but that was the standard response. Historians still argue whether priests genuinely believed these marriages were spiritually sound, or whether they were simply swept along by dynastic necessity. Canon law permitted girls to marry at 12 after all, and the church declared marriage a sacrament. But in private, some priests recorded their unease. One confessor in 14th century Italy scribbled in his diary that he felt tormented by hearing the frightened words of a child bride, yet he absolved her anyway, because what else could he do? Quirky detail, confession manuals from the late Middle Ages actually included sample questions for priests to ask married teenagers. Some were practical. Do you resist your husband's will? While others veered into the absurdly invasive, do you allow him to approach only when you are fertile? Picture a shy 14-year-old trying to answer these questions while staring at her shoes, cheeks burning red. The role of confessors wasn't only to comfort, it was also to maintain the machinery of dynastic survival. A priest might gently urge a teenage bride to accept her role as mother of heirs, framing obedience as a path to salvation. Resistance was treated not as trauma but as sin. Yet, paradoxically, some confessors became allies. A sympathetic priest might allow a bride to vent her fears, even offering small acts of protection, delaying her return to her husband's bedchamber with lengthy prayers or urging longer recovery after childbirth. Sometimes the confessor's dilemma extended to secrecy. If a bride admitted she loved another, or dreaded consummation, or even considered fleeing, the priest was bound by the seal of confession. Imagine the tension. A man who knew the inner torment of a duchess but was forbidden to speak, even as her fate played out publicly. You probably wouldn't survive holding that kind of secret. The dilemma deepened when politics intruded. Kings and dukes sometimes pressured confessors to report on their wives' obedience. Did she complain? Did she refuse her marital duties? Priests faced impossible choices: betray a terrified teenager's confidence or risk angering the most powerful men in Europe. Historians debate how much these confessions influenced policy. Did whispered fears change anything? Occasionally, yes. There are cases where priests quietly urged husbands to delay consummation or to show kindness, citing the girl's fragile health. In other instances, the advice fell on deaf ears, dismissed as weakness. And then there's the irony. The church, which sanctified child marriages, also became the only place where brides could express doubts without fear of punishment, at least in theory. Confession was both a trap and a lifeline, a ritual that reinforced obedience but also allowed small cracks of honesty. So as you linger in that chapel, the flicker of candles casting long shadows across the carved wood, you realize how strange the confessor's role truly was. He was both the keeper of secrets and the enforcer of duty, torn between compassion and canon law. The teenage bride, meanwhile, walked away clutching her rosary tighter, her whispered fears recorded only in the silence of the booth and the troubled conscience of the man on the other side. The hush of the chapel fades and you wander into another corner of the castle, a chamber with tapestries muffling the walls, a single narrow window letting in a slice of pale light. Here you sense the weight of silence, the kind that presses down like a cloak. This is the space of the teenage bride's private world, where the endless duties, expectations, and fears condensed into something almost unbearable. Silent suffering was the unspoken rule of her existence. Picture a 15-year-old duchess pacing the chamber. She has jewels braided into her hair and rings heavy on her fingers, but her hands tremble. She knows she is expected to smile at banquets, curtsy with grace, and bear airs without complaint. Yet in these private moments, she collapses onto her bed, clutching a pillow, fighting tears that no one is supposed to see. You probably wouldn't survive a single week in that kind of gilded cage, where every sigh could be overheard and every weakness reported. Historians still argue whether these young brides truly accepted their roles as natural or whether their compliance was the result of relentless conditioning. Chronicles rarely capture their voices directly, which means their suffering echoes only faintly through letters, confessions, and the occasional scandal, but the silence itself is telling. A lack of protest in the records doesn't mean peace, it means fear. Quirky detail: some noble families hired whispering women or older governesses to watch over new brides, not as companions, but as monitors. These attendants were expected to report if the bride cried too much, resisted her husband, or expressed homesickness. Imagine living with a built-in spy who smiled sweetly by day and tattled by night. Privacy was a luxury aristocratic girls rarely had. The suffering wasn't always dramatic. Sometimes it was slow erosion, loneliness in a foreign land, meals taken in silence, the constant reminder that she was valued only for the children she could produce. A teenager who once loved to laugh might become subdued, her voice barely more than a whisper in crowded halls. Chroniclers described such girls as meek or pious, but behind those polite adjectives was often exhaustion. And then there were the tragedies of homesickness. Letters from young brides reveal aching hearts for mothers, siblings, and childhood gardens left behind. One girl in Burgundy wrote that she dreamed of the smell of her family's orchard, though she now lived in a palace of stone. Her letter trails off into blotches of ink, tears perhaps, or simply clumsy hands unused to writing in candlelight. Either way, her voice speaks across centuries, a quiet testimony of suffering. Occasionally, silent suffering tipped into illness. Medieval physicians even coined terms like melancholia of marriage, treating noble brides with herbal tonics and holy water. Some believed the cure was pregnancy, because apparently nothing relieves despair like adding childbirth into the mix. Historians still debate whether these ailments were physical, psychological, or both, but the pattern is consistent. Young girls buckled under pressures too heavy for their age, and yet silence didn't always mean resignation. In some cases, it was strategy. A bride who endured quietly gained a reputation for obedience, which could later be leveraged for influence. By appearing submissive, she avoided scandal, buying time until she could wield soft power as a mother or dowager. It was a dangerous gamble, but it was one of the few available to her. So as you stand in that chamber, the air thick with unspoken words, you realize that history rarely recorded screams. It recorded treaties, births, and deaths, but not the hours when a teenage bride sat staring at the floor, her lips pressed tight against the sob that never left her throat. And that silence, echoing louder than any feast or coronation, is perhaps the truest reminder of what it meant to be married off too young in the name of dynasty. The quiet chamber of unspoken tears gives way to a softer glow, almost like dawn breaking through stained glass. Not every teenage marriage was pure tragedy. Amidst the ledgers, dowries, and whispered fears, there were rare stories where affection actually bloomed, where two frightened young people somehow found comfort in each other, and the union, against all odds, turned tender. Picture a pair of teenagers married in a rush for politics sitting awkwardly across from each other at a banquet table. At first, their conversations are stiff, filled with rehearsed courtesies drilled into them by tutors. But later, when the hall is quiet, one nervously asks about the other's favorite pastime. Perhaps she likes falconry. Perhaps he admits he plays dice with his pages. They laugh just a little, breaking the ice. You probably wouldn't survive the awkwardness of that first chat, but somehow it becomes the seed of something real. Take the case of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile. Though both were teenagers when they married in 1469, she was 18, he was 17, their union became one of the most famous partnerships in European history. Their political alliance reshaped Spain, but it was also marked by mutual respect and genuine collaboration. Historians still argue how much personal affection was at play versus shared ambition, but their letters suggest warmth alongside politics. Quirky detail: some couples exchanged playful notes or gifts that revealed glimpses of affection. In one surviving letter, a young noble husband apologized for being late to a dinner with his wife because he'd been stuck in council. He promised to make it up to her with music that evening. Hardly a sweeping love sonnet, but in a world where many brides never got so much as a kind word, it was extraordinary. Sometimes these rare happy endings grew simply from proximity. A pair of young spouses forced to spend so much time together in unfamiliar surroundings might cling to each other for solace. A 15-year-old bride and a 16-year-old groom might discover they shared the same sense of humor or leaned on each other to navigate the confusing rituals of court life. That shared awkwardness could turn into real companionship. Of course, it was never a fairy tale. Even the happiest teenage marriages were still forged under immense pressure. Children still arrived early, responsibilities weighed heavily, and freedom was limited. But within that gilded cage, some couples found ways to make the best of it. Imagine a teenage queen sneaking into the gardens with her equally young husband, laughing at the absurd pomp of their lives, tossing rose petals at each other when no one was watching. There are even cases where widowed brides mourned sincerely for husbands they had once dreaded marrying. Chroniclers occasionally noted teenage queens wearing black for years after their spouse's death, refusing to remarry. Historians debate whether this was true love or strategic widowhood, but the depth of mourning suggests at least some marriages transformed into bonds stronger than duty. These exceptions remind you that humanity seeped even through the cracks of dynastic machinery. Behind the rigid structures of contracts and alliances, real emotions sometimes bloomed, and when they did, they startled chroniclers enough to be recorded because they were rare, unexpected, even scandalous. So as you drift through this softer-lit hall, you catch glimpses of laughter amid the shadows, a shy smile between two awkward teenagers, a letter folded carefully with tender words, a small act of kindness in a world where kindness wasn't guaranteed. These are the rare threads of warmth woven into the heavy fabric of aristocratic duty. Fragile, yes, but real enough to remind you that not all teenage marriages were cages without light. The soft glow of laughter fades, and you step into a grand reception chamber where foreign ambassadors stand stiffly in brocade robes, their eyes darting with curiosity. This is the stage where Europe's teenage brides became spectacles, not just wives, but symbols paraded before outsiders who judged entire kingdoms by their youth and beauty. Picture the scene. An envoy from Venice enters a French court. He bows low, but his sharp eyes flick immediately toward the Queen, a girl of barely 14. He scribbles notes in his diary later that evening. She is young, modest, and pleasing in countenance, though perhaps too pale. These records survive today, filled with details so oddly specific that you'd think diplomats were doubling as teenage fashion critics. You probably wouldn't survive being evaluated like a horse at auction, but for foreign ambassadors this was part of the job description. Quirky detail, ambassadors often reported on whether brides blushed, spoke clearly, or looked healthy because those things were considered indicators of fertility and strength. In one account, a Spanish envoy mocked an English princess for her childish voice, while another gushed about a French girl's blooming cheeks, as if her complexion could predict the success of an alliance. The spectacle worked both ways. When a teenage princess was sent abroad to marry, the receiving court scrutinized her with equal intensity. Imagine arriving in a foreign land at 15, stepping off a barge while crowds craned their necks to see if you looked regal enough. Every detail, from the embroidery on your sleeves to the way you descended the gangplank, was silently judged as a reflection of your homeland. Historians still argue whether these first impressions had real political consequences or were just gossip fodder, but chroniclers took them seriously enough to record in excruciating detail. And then there were the ambassadors' letters back home. Entire diplomatic strategies hinged on these teenage brides' appearances and manners. If a girl was described as charming, it bolstered her family's prestige. If she was said to be plain or awkward, it could spark ridicule. One Venetian ambassador once remarked that a newlywed queen was as comely as she is pious, though her youth betrays her in conversation. Translation: she looked fine but had the conversational skills of a nervous schoolgirl. Sometimes the ambassadors themselves became part of the scandal. Stories circulate of envoys growing too fond of the young queens they observed. One rumor even claimed a diplomat smuggled love poems to a teenage bride, though whether she reciprocated or simply panicked, history doesn't say. Imagine being trapped between dynasties and suddenly receiving flirty notes from a man paid to spy on you. Awkward doesn't begin to cover it. Foreign visitors were also stunned by cultural differences. When ambassadors from the Ottoman Empire visited European courts, they were shocked at how publicly young brides were displayed. Conversely, European envoys in Istanbul marveled at the seclusion of palace women, whispering about harems as though they were fairy tales. Across these contrasts, the theme remained the same. Teenage brides were evaluated less as people and more as symbols of political health. One quirky custom: some courts paraded their brides on horseback to impress visiting dignitaries. Imagine a 14-year-old girl, barely steady in the saddle, draped in velvet, riding through the streets while crowds roared. Chroniclers praised her bravery if she stayed upright, and mocked her mercilessly if she wobbled. Talk about high-stakes horsemanship. So, as you stand among the rustling robes of envoys, listening to their clipped voices and watching their hawk-like eyes, you realize how surreal it all was. These foreign ambassadors weren't just noting treaties or trade deals, they were writing Yelp reviews of teenage brides, as though an entire kingdom's honor could hinge on whether a nervous girl smiled convincingly at a banquet. The murmurs of the ambassadors fade, and now you're drawn into a chamber where the air is tense with expectation. The carved doors are shut, courtiers linger outside, and inside the only sound is the uneven breathing of a young queen being carefully watched by her attendants. This is the heart of dynastic obsession, the quest for heirs. Every movement, every cough, every meal she ate was scrutinized for signs that she might be carrying the future of a kingdom. Picture a 15-year-old bride being led to bed on her wedding night, courtiers whispering behind the door. From that moment onward, her body wasn't hers alone. It belonged to the dynasty. The pressure was suffocating. If her belly swelled, bells rang. If months passed with no change, rumors spread like wildfire. You probably wouldn't survive the stress of having an entire court monitor your menstrual cycle, but that was the daily reality for these teenage brides. Historians still argue whether fertility was viewed with awe or as cold calculation. To some, it was sacred. Queens were vessels chosen by God to deliver heirs. To others, it was a commodity, measured as ruthlessly as a harvest. Either way, one truth stands out. Without heirs, even the most glittering marriage lost its shine. Quirky detail, some courts hired womb watchers, older noblewomen tasked with observing and reporting on the queen's condition. They checked her appetite, her complexion, even the way she walked. If she yawned too often, someone whispered she might be pregnant. If she sneezed, people wondered if it meant miscarriage. The absurdity would be comical if the stakes weren't so deadly serious. Consider Catherine of Aragon, married first to Arthur, Prince of Wales, and then to his brother Henry VIII. She endured multiple pregnancies and miscarriages, each one a public affair. Her body was the battlefield upon which England's succession crisis played out. By the time she was cast aside, her teenage years had long vanished into a blur of expectation and grief. The same obsession haunted France. Anne of Austria, married at 14 to Louis XIII, struggled for 2 decades before producing an heir. The whispers of infertility nearly shattered her reputation. Imagine the humiliation. Every feast, every mass, courtiers glanced at her belly before they looked at her face. It wasn't until she finally gave birth to Louis XV, the Sun King, that her marriage was vindicated in the eyes of history. Even miscarriages weren't private. Courtiers speculated openly. Ambassadors wrote home about failed hopes. An entire nation sighed in disappointment. A teenage girl might weep in private, but in public, she was expected to carry herself with grace as though nothing had happened. You probably wouldn't survive the emotional whiplash, joy one moment, public humiliation the next. But aristocratic brides had no choice. Sometimes the pressure led to desperation. Herbal remedies, pilgrimages to holy shrines, even bizarre superstitions were employed to coax fertility. In one odd case, a queen was told to sleep with a relic of St. Anne beneath her pillow to improve her chances of conception. Did it work? Historians debate whether faith or luck was at play, but 9 months later, a child was born, and when heirs finally arrived, the celebrations bordered on manic. Bells rang through cities, feasts lasted for days, and poets proclaimed the birth as proof that God favored the dynasty. The young mother, barely recovered from childbirth, was paraded like a victorious general. Her body bore the cost, but the crown reaped the glory. So, as you stand in that chamber, hearing the whispered speculations and feeling the weight of centuries of expectation, you see the truth laid bare. Aristocrats married teenagers not just for alliances or dowries, but because they were obsessed, utterly, desperately obsessed with heirs. To them, the future of nations rested in the womb of a child, and that terrifying gamble was the axis upon which all dynasties turned. The anxious murmurs of heir watchers fade as you step into a chamber lined with law books and illuminated manuscripts. Here, the conversation shifts from whispers about fertility to debates about legality. Aristocrats, after all, were masters of loopholes. If marrying teenagers seemed questionable, they could always point to the shifting, slippery laws of the time, laws that treated childhood and adulthood like negotiable categories rather than fixed stages of life. Canon law set the bar shockingly low. Girls could marry at 12, boys at 14. These numbers were justified with reference to puberty, not emotional readiness. Once a girl had her first menstruation, she was considered capable of bearing heirs and therefore capable of marriage. You probably wouldn't survive having your entire future decided by biology, but for noble families, that was the ultimate green light. Yet local customs often pushed back. In some regions of Northern Europe, marriage at such tender ages was frowned upon, even if technically legal. Communities preferred brides closer to 16 or 17, believing younger marriages risked both health and scandal. Historians still argue whether these customs had real power or whether canon law always trumped them, but the tension between law and practice shaped countless lives. Quirky detail: in England, marriages could be contracted by words of the present tense even between children, so long as both said, "I take you," in the moment. That meant 2 10-year-olds could technically marry if prompted. Whether those unions were consummated immediately was another matter, but the paperwork was binding. Imagine a pair of nervous children repeating vows they didn't even understand, with adults applauding as though it were poetry. There were also notorious cases of annulments hinging on age. If a marriage soured, one family might suddenly remember that the bride was underage at the time of the vows and demand the union be declared invalid. In some courts, meticulous debates ensued. Did she look 12, or had she already turned 13? Was her puberty visible enough to count? The absurdity makes you want to laugh, but for the girls involved, it was deadly serious. One famous case involved Margaret Beaufort again, married at 12 and pregnant at 13. After her husband's death, some argued her marriage had been invalid due to her age at the time of the vows. Of course, once her son became Henry VII, nobody dared challenge it anymore. Laws bent easily when thrones were at stake. The Church itself wasn't blind to the contradictions. Some theologians argued that consent was meaningless if the parties were too young to understand what they agreed to. Others countered that consent was irrelevant so long as consummation occurred later. This legal hair-splitting allowed aristocrats to arrange betrothals in childhood, activate the marriage at puberty, and call the whole process holy. And then there's the irony. While aristocrats wrangled over loopholes, ordinary villagers often married later, in their late teens or early 20s, when they could actually run a household together. It was the nobles, those most obsessed with power, who pushed the boundaries of legality, turning children into spouses while hiding behind canon law. Quirky practices cropped up everywhere. In parts of Italy, contracts specified that a bride who married before puberty would live separately from her husband until she ripened. In France, witnesses sometimes had to swear under oath that the bride was old enough, leading to awkward courtroom scenes where grey-haired uncles solemnly testified about a girl's development. You probably wouldn't survive that kind of invasive scrutiny, but it was all part of the dynastic machinery. So as you pace this imagined legal chamber with its heavy tomes and crackling parchment, you see how fragile the concept of age of consent really was. Aristocrats bent rules to suit ambition, cloaking dynastic bargains in the language of canon law. And while modern readers recoil at the thought, in their world, the shifting definitions of maturity gave them exactly the wiggle room they needed to turn children into pawns of dynastic survival. The echo of lawyers debating in their chambers fades, and you find yourself in a quieter corner of the castle, a place filled not with law books, but with scraps of paper, wax seals, and folded notes slipped under doors. These are the voices of the teenage brides themselves, faint, fragile, and often ignored, but sometimes preserved in letters of lament. Picture a 14-year-old queen sitting at a writing desk, her hands ink-stained, the candle flickering as she bends over parchment. She writes not to negotiate treaties or tally dowries, but to pour out loneliness. "I long for the orchard of my childhood," one bride confessed, "for the songs my sisters sang in the evenings. Here I am alone." You probably wouldn't survive exile from your own family at that age, but for aristocratic brides, separation was the first and hardest duty. Historians still argue how much these letters reflect genuine feeling and how much was shaped by courtly conventions. Some read like diary entries, raw and unpolished. Others follow the formulas of medieval rhetoric, carefully balanced between duty and sorrow. But even the most stylized letters carry hints of despair. Quirky detail. Brides often sent letters begging for pets or familiar objects from home. One young duchess requested that her family send her lapdog across the channel because she could not sleep without its warmth at her feet. Another pleaded for her lute, saying the music would ease her sorrow in a strange land. These requests sound almost childlike, and that's because beneath the tiaras and gowns they really were children. Some letters addressed to mothers are heartbreaking. A teenage bride in Burgundy wrote, "They watch me always, even when I walk. I cannot speak as I did with you. My heart feels as though it has been caged." Her mother's reply, preserved in fragments, urged her to accept her duty with patience, offering comfort, but no hope of change. Imagine being told at 15 that endurance was the only solution to despair. Not all laments were so gentle. Some letters seethed with frustration. A young Queen of Navarre once scrawled to her cousin, "They make me sit beside him and nod. I would rather be in the fields with the shepherd girls than at this table of liars." Was this genuine rebellion or youthful dramatics? Historians debate, but the rawness leaps off the page. Of course, not all letters survived. Many were destroyed, either by embarrassed families or by the brides themselves, fearful their private words would be read aloud in hostile courts. The fact that any exist at all is miraculous. Each one is a crack in the armor of aristocratic silence, a reminder that behind the masks of dignity were trembling hands gripping quills. Sometimes letters never reached their destinations, couriers misplaced them, or hostile in-laws intercepted them. Imagine the humiliation of a young bride pouring her heart onto paper, only for her mother-in-law to read it aloud in mockery. You probably wouldn't survive the betrayal, and neither did many of these girls, at least not emotionally. And yet amidst the sorrow you occasionally glimpse resilience. One girl wrote, "Though I weep, I will not break. They may bind me in silks, but my thoughts are my own." That line, written centuries ago, still vibrates with defiance. It reminds you that even within cages there were sparks of selfhood, small embers that refused to be extinguished. So as you sit in this shadowy room, parchment scattered across the desk, you feel the presence of voices almost lost to history. Aristocrats may have married teenagers to seal alliances, but those teenagers left behind faint whispers in ink, letters that still breathe centuries later, carrying the sorrow, the frustration, and the fragile hope of girls forced to grow up far too soon. The scratch of quills fades, and you step into a different kind of chamber, not a library or feast hall, but the restless space of public opinion. Here, voices are not confined to letters, but echoed through sermons, pamphlets, and the occasional daring chronicler. While most accepted teenage marriages as the natural order of aristocratic life, a few critics raised their eyebrows and muttered, sometimes loudly, about the cruelty of it all. Imagine a priest in a wooden pulpit, his voice booming through a cold cathedral. He rails not against heresy or corruption this time, but against the spectacle of children in wedding gowns. "Is this holy matrimony or a bargain of merchants?" he demands, while the congregation shifts uncomfortably. You probably wouldn't survive the tension in that pew, wondering whether the bishop would punish him or applaud his courage. Historians still argue whether such criticisms were common or rare. Many sermons have been lost, but fragments suggest that some clergy found the practice deeply troubling. One chronicler in 14th century Italy described a noble wedding where the bride was so young she could barely lift her veil. He added dryly, "It seemed less a union than a sale." Not exactly the kind of line you'd find in court poetry. Quirky detail. In certain towns, ordinary people voiced disapproval through satire. Ballads mocked old men who married girls young enough to be their daughters. In Germany, a popular verse sneered at a duke who wed a 13-year-old, warning that his cradle might soon rock beside hers. It's the medieval equivalent of late-night comedy skewering politicians, except the punchline was whispered nervously in taverns. Even among nobles there were dissenting voices. Some mothers worried openly that their daughters were being sacrificed too early. Letters survive where aristocratic women pleaded with husbands to delay marriages until their girls were stronger. A few succeeded, others were ignored. Still, their protests ripple faintly through the records, proof that not everyone saw these unions as inevitable. The intellectual ferment of the Renaissance eventually added fuel. Humanist writers like Erasmus criticized marriages based solely on dowries and alliances, urging instead that mutual affection and maturity mattered. Was he speaking of love in a modern sense? Not quite. But his arguments crack the facade, suggesting that maybe, just maybe, using children as bargaining chips was less than ideal. Historians debate whether these ideas changed behavior immediately, but they certainly planted seeds, and sometimes criticism came from unexpected quarters. In England, peasants during the 1381 revolt mocked the nobility's hypocrisy, chanting that lords who scorned villagers' marriages happily sold their own daughters at 12. Imagine the scandal of hearing blunt truth shouted by farmers with pitchforks. Aristocrats dismissed it as insolence, but the sting lingered. Still, pushback remained limited. For every critic, there were dozens who defended the practice as natural, biblical, or politically necessary. Supporters cited the Virgin Mary's young age at betrothal, twisting sacred example into justification. You probably wouldn't survive the mental gymnastics, but it shows how deeply entrenched the logic was. So as you stand in this imagined chamber of murmurs and protests, you hear two currents, the overwhelming tide of acceptance and the faint, rebellious trickle of dissent. Aristocrats may have believed teenage marriages kept dynasties afloat, but scattered voices, priests, poets, mothers, and peasants saw the cruelty beneath the silks and dared, however quietly, to call it what it was, a spectacle both shameful and sad. The murmurs of dissent ripple away, and you step into a long gallery where fashions shift like the flicker of torchlight. Here, portraits and chronicles reveal how, over time, the definition of a marriageable age began to drift upward. What once seemed normal, girls wed at 12, 13, 14, gradually gave way to older brides, reshaped by changes in medicine, culture, and even simple fashion. Picture the late medieval court, gowns with high waists and flowing sleeves, hair braided under jeweled circlets. These were designed for young brides, slim and slight. But by the 16th century, fashion began to favor fuller figures, broader hips, and elaborate bodices. Suddenly, a 16 or 17-year-old was considered ideal, old enough to fill the gowns, young enough to bear heirs. You probably wouldn't survive corsets or whalebone stays, but the shift mattered. Clothing quietly raised the bar for acceptable age. Historians still argue what came first, the medical advice or the fashion trends. Physicians began cautioning that pregnancy too young could endanger both mother and child. Midwives echoed the same concern, insisting that girls needed to ripen before childbirth. Meanwhile, chroniclers praised noblewomen who bore children later, framing it as prudent rather than risky. Slowly, the pendulum swung. Quirky detail, in some German courts, officials introduced health checks for brides. Girls were inspected by midwives to determine whether their bodies were ready for marriage. If deemed too frail, the wedding might be postponed. Imagine the indignity of a stranger prodding you and announcing to a room of nobles whether your hips were suitable. Privacy? Not in the dynastic playbook. Economics also played a role. By the late Middle Ages, noble dowries ballooned to staggering amounts. Families needed more time to gather the wealth, which conveniently meant daughters often married later. A girl of 16 might bring a dowry twice as rich as one of 13, simply because her family had had more years to accumulate the goods. Finance, as much as morality, nudged the average age upward. The Renaissance emphasis on education added another twist. More noble families invested in tutoring daughters in languages, music, and theology. A well-educated bride fetched higher prestige, and that required time. Catherine de' Medici, for instance, arrived in France with not only a dowry, but also a reputation for learning, a reputation impossible had she been married off at 12. Still, the change was uneven. In southern Europe, teenage marriages remained common longer, while northern courts drifted toward later unions. Some regions even celebrated older brides, portraying them as sturdier, wiser, and more capable of ruling households. You can almost hear the sighs of relief from 14-year-old girls who finally had a few more years before being shoved into wedding gowns. But the old mindset never disappeared entirely. Even as the ideal age crept higher, dynasties remained obsessed with fertility. If a girl reached 20 unmarried, whispers of spinsterhood haunted her halls. The pressure shifted, not vanished. So as you stroll this gallery of changing fashions and shifting advice, you see how fragile cultural norms really are. What one century insisted was holy and natural, the next quietly adjusted with a shrug, as though marrying at 17 instead of 13 had always been the plan. Progress was glacial, uneven, and often self-serving, but it planted the seeds for a world where teenage brides were no longer the unquestioned standard. The gallery of fashions fades, and you enter a grand hall buzzing not with music, but with debate. Candles burn low, pamphlets scatter across the floor, and the air crackles with the new electricity of the Enlightenment. Here, philosophers, satirists, and revolutionaries sharpen their quills, and suddenly the centuries-old practice of marrying off teenagers looks less like holy tradition and more like absurd tyranny. Imagine Voltaire at his desk, smirking as he pens lines mocking aristocrats for treating daughters like cattle. Across Europe, thinkers began questioning whether noble marriages served anything beyond greed and vanity. You probably wouldn't survive the endless salons filled with powdered wigs and heated arguments, but this was where ideals of freedom, reason, and individual rights began to collide with old dynastic customs. Historians still argue how much Enlightenment criticism truly changed behavior versus how much was philosophical posturing. On one hand, noble families continued arranging marriages for alliances well into the 18th century. On the other, a growing chorus insisted that unions should be based on affection or at least mutual consent rather than contracts signed over barrels of wine. Quirky detail. Some satirical pamphlets depicted bloated old dukes waddling down the aisle with girls half their size, caricatured as wide-eyed dolls. The captions were merciless, calling the practice the shame of Christendom. Imagine those cartoons being passed hand to hand in taverns, scandalizing noblemen who pretended not to notice, but secretly fumed. In France, revolution amplified the critique. Peasants sneered that lords who condemned immorality had no issue marrying children for power. When the Bastille fell, pamphlets openly attacked the hypocrisy of aristocratic unions. One revolutionary slogan even mocked noble weddings as contracts of slavery signed with ribbons. You can almost hear the sarcasm dripping from every word. At the same time, Enlightenment thinkers proposed reforms. Philosophers like Rousseau emphasized the importance of education and maturity before marriage, arguing that young women should be nurtured rather than bartered. While his own ideas about gender were contradictory, the emphasis on readiness marked a shift. Even monarchs paid attention. Joseph II of Austria, in his flurry of reforms, raised the minimum marriage age in his territories, declaring that unions should not be made in haste or ignorance. Still, the clash of ideals was messy. Aristocrats defended their traditions fiercely, insisting that marriage was too important to be left to youthful whims of affection. Critics countered that teenage marriages produced misery, high mortality, and weak alliances anyway. Historians debate whether the Enlightenment was truly a turning point or merely the moment the practice began to lose its untouchable aura. One curious anecdote comes from Paris salons, where teenage brides themselves occasionally joined the conversation. A young noblewoman once shocked an audience by declaring she had been married at 14 and had no memory of childhood. Her words were met with gasps and sympathetic applause, a rare moment when society recognized the cost behind the custom. As the 18th century crept toward revolution, aristocratic marriages became symbols of everything outdated and unjust. no longer portrayed as noble sacrifices for dynasties, they were cast as grotesque spectacles of power gone rotten. Enlightenment satire didn't abolish the practice overnight, but it shifted the narrative. Teenage marriage was no longer destiny, but a scandal waiting to be mocked. So as you walk across this pamphlet-strewn floor, hearing the sharp laughter of philosophers and the indignant muttering of nobles, you see the tide turning. What had once been cloaked in incense, jewels, and holy water was now exposed to the harsh glare of reason, and under that light the practice looked less like tradition and more like absurd cruelty, ripe for revolution, to tear apart. The pamphlets of the Enlightenment flutter away, and you drift into a quieter salon, where velvet curtains hush the outside world, and a group of readers lean over novels and librettos. Here, teenage marriages no longer appear in ledgers or court records, but on stages and in stories, romanticized, dramatized, and softened into myth. Reality had been cruel, but fiction painted it with pastel tones. Imagine a theatre in Paris, the chandeliers blazing as an opera begins. The heroine is a young bride, barely in her teens, who finds herself swept into passion, heartbreak, or political intrigue. The audience sighs, their hearts moved, not by the harsh truth of dynastic duty, but by the glittering fantasy of youthful love. You probably wouldn't survive the absurd melodrama, but the crowd ate it up. Historians still argue whether these tales reflected real critiques of aristocratic marriage or simply indulged the public's appetite for escapism. Either way, by the 18th and 19th centuries, literature was busy rewriting teenage unions as tragic romances rather than cold bargains. Shakespeare, centuries earlier, had already given us Juliet, 13 years old, idealized as the very essence of love. Later authors borrowed the same trope, polishing it until it glittered, no matter how harsh reality had been. Quirky detail, some painters even leaned into the myth, producing portraits of brides as tender, angelic figures surrounded by symbols of innocence, roses, doves, or cherubs. These weren't commissions from the brides themselves, but propaganda to make dynasties look less ruthless. It's one thing to marry your daughter at 14. It's another to have her painted as a serene vision of divine love, making the whole thing look almost sweet. Operas and novels weren't always gentle, though. Some leaned into the tragedy. A young heroine trapped in an arranged marriage might pine for true love, her songs swelling with longing. Audiences adored these melodramas, and the irony is delicious. The same nobles who forced their daughters into unions often paid to watch fictional teenage brides cry on stage. You probably wouldn't survive the hypocrisy, but history has a dark sense of humor. By the 19th century, Romanticism had fully embraced the idea of doomed young love. Teenage brides were no longer pawns, they were martyrs of passion. Their suffering became entertainment, their lack of agency rewritten as noble sacrifice. Think of Goethe's The Sorrows of Young Werther, which electrified Europe with its tale of youthful despair. It wasn't exactly about marriage, but it fed the myth of young love as pure, intense, and tragically short-lived. And so the brutal bargains of medieval courts transformed into candlelit fantasies. Where once a girl's letters revealed sorrow and duty, novels now dressed her in gowns of poetry and painted her sighs as symbols of universal longing. Historians debate whether this transformation dulled public outrage or actually fueled criticism by reminding readers how fragile young lives were. Either way, the myth stuck. Quirky tidbit, even today people still swoon over stories like Juliet's, forgetting she was barely old enough to be in middle school. The romantic veil persists, clouding the stark truth. Behind the operas, the plays, and the novels, the old reality still lingers. Teenage marriages were less about love than about survival, politics, and heirs. So as you sit in that salon, listening to the rustle of pages and the soft hum of music drifting from a harpsichord, you realize that memory itself was reshaped. The cold, hard arithmetic of dynasties was rewritten as romance, and audiences, then as now, preferred the story with roses and violins over the one with contracts and tears. The strains of the salon music fade, and you drift into a quieter, modern room. No chandeliers or scrolls here, just the hum of electric light and the steady tick of a clock. This is the final chamber of our long wandering, where history's echoes meet today's debates. Because though the castles and coronets are gone, the memory of aristocrats marrying teenagers still lingers, shaping how we talk about marriage, agency, and childhood even now. You sit with the knowledge that in the medieval and Renaissance worlds, marrying off daughters at 12 or 13 was as common as lighting a torch at sundown. It was justified by canon law, wrapped in holy water, gilded with feasts and frozen in portraits. But beneath all the ritual and splendor, it was always the same story. Dynasties gambling with children's lives. Historians still argue whether the practice was universally accepted or constantly questioned at the edges, but no one denies the cost borne by those teenagers whose childhoods were bartered for treaties. In the modern world, the practice is remembered with unease, even outrage. We recoil at the idea of children used as bargaining chips, even while romantic myths like Juliet's still circulate, blurring memory with poetry. And yet, child marriage hasn't vanished entirely. It persists in corners of the globe where poverty, tradition, or politics push young girls into unions before they are ready. The echoes of castles still resound in village squares. Quirky detail, modern activists sometimes invoke historical examples in their campaigns, pointing out that kings and queens once did the same thing to their children, as if to say, see, even the powerful were guilty of it. History becomes a tool, reminding us that cruelty dressed in velvet is still cruelty. And so you sit here, in this final chamber, reflecting. You remember the lavish halls where brides were paraded like trophies, the dowry books that read like grocery lists, the galleries of portraits painting girls as dignified matrons, the confessional booths where they whispered their fears. You remember the laughter of feasts masking their anxiety, the letters of lament scratched out in candlelight, and the rare flickers of rebellion or affection. You remember the obsession with heirs, the loopholes of canon law, the critics in pulpits and pamphlets, and the eventual shift toward older brides fueled by medicine, fashion, and philosophy. You remember, too, how literature romanticized it all, turning real suffering into pretty myths. Now, as the story winds down, your body softens into stillness. The frantic voices of dynasties fade, the clink of goblets and the scratch of quills dissolving into silence. What remains is the hush of history, the kind that seeps into your bones and makes you grateful that the world, for all its flaws, has shifted even slightly away from those gilded cages. Breathe a little slower now. Picture the castles empty, their halls echoing only with wind. The portraits of teenage brides gather dust, their painted eyes no longer scrutinized. The letters lie folded in forgotten chests, the candles burn low. Nothing is demanded of you here, no contracts, no treaties, no heirs, just rest. Let your thoughts drift like parchment caught in a breeze, floating beyond reach. The weight of dynasties is not yours to carry. The story has been told, the voice is heard, and now the night is yours alone. And so, with the last echo fading, we slow the pace even further. Imagine yourself lying beneath a canopy of stars, the air cool and gentle, every sound softened by distance. The heavy stone walls of castles are far behind you now. Only quiet fields stretch in every direction, hushed and endless. The images of tonight's journey, crowded banquets, flickering torches, whispered confessions, slip away one by one, like candles being gently snuffed. You're left with nothing but stillness, a calm that feels both ancient and familiar. The teenage brides of history, their laughter and tears, are part of a story long past. You can let them rest, and let yourself rest too. Your breathing evens out, deeper now, like the slow pull of waves against the shore. The weight of dynastic ambition, of dowries and treaties, has dissolved. What remains is light, moonlight on stone, starlight on water, and the soft glow of your own quiet heart. Feel your body grow heavy, sinking into the mattress as if it were the earth itself cradling you. Your thoughts drift further apart, slower and softer, until they feel less like thoughts and more like dreams waiting to arrive. Let the last whisper be reassurance. You are safe, you are whole, and nothing more is required of you tonight. The past has faded, the story is complete. Close your eyes now, sink into silence, and drift gently towards sleep. Sweet dreams.